Hey, thanks for joining me. So today I want to talk about glue, this sticky, gooey stuff that we use to hold things together when building or repairing instruments. And it's really essential in the building and repairing of instruments. And there's several different kinds of glue I use depending on what I'm doing. And each has their purpose, each has its use, and it's not like you can just use one glue for everything. Some people, that build instruments may tend to use like hot hide glue almost exclusively, but when you're doing repair work, sometimes I find that, sometimes I need something with a longer setting time. And if it's a vintage instrument, I might want to use a protein-based glue, but, not, the complexity of the repair and the clamping that I'm going to have to do requires a longer working time than hot hide glue. So there's alternatives, and so I want to talk about some of the different things that I use. And there's probably something I'm leaving out as I'm thinking about what I set on my bench back here. I realized that I'm gonna have to go grab a tube of Duco, which I use for plastic binding and stuff. So there's all kinds of glues, but I'm gonna kind of walk you through the ones that I use and what I use them for and why I use them for certain things. And I think you'll see why it's a good idea when you're doing instrument repair, especially when you're working on a wide variety of instruments, from old vintage instruments, violins and old guitars and stuff, to modern instruments, why it's really helpful to have a wide variety of adhesives. So let's look at the gooey glue stuff that we use. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, let's take a look at some of these glues. I don't even got some of the tools I use to apply them. We're going to start with something really basic. I'm going to unplug this thing so I don't drag the cord around. The first thing is hot hide glue. Now here you can see I have a glue pot that I use, and this has actually been plugged in so it's warmed up. Not quite warmed up, it's sitting at 130-ish degrees. And normally once it's sat for a while it'll get to 140. I'll show you a picture kind of from the side of this pot so you can kind of see it from a different angle, but rather than looking straight down on top of it. So you can see this is a vintage glue pot. It actually has a separate copper pot inside the heating unit. The heating unit this isn't actually a glue pot that was made, I don't know, judging by the look of it, probably in the 40s or 50s, and it is used, specifically for glue. Now I think back when this thing was new, I don't know if they necessarily used it as a water bath, but for whatever wood shop used it, maybe furniture manufacturing something, they may have just mixed the glue straight in the pot. I'm using it as a water bath. Yeah, it's about 130 degrees right now. And in here you can see I've got a little jar of glue. I'm going to pull that out. Set this back aside. It was a really lucky find to find this glue pot. I found it at an antique flea market, and I didn't even know if it worked, but it was only like $8 or $10. I mix very small amounts of hot hide glue at a time. You can see this little jar. I've got some bigger jars like this if I want to mix more of it. But really, for most of the work I do, a very small amount is all that's needed. Now, hot hide glue comes granulated. It looks like this stuff. And there's a number of places you can get it. If you search for hot hide glue online, or even on Amazon, you can find, all kinds of suppliers for it. This is 192 gram strength glue, which is pretty standard for use in instrument repair. I'll typically use a brush like this for applying it, and when I'm not using it, so that it doesn't go bad, I'll either put it in the refrigerator, or if I'm really not going to use it for a while, I'll put it in the freezer. You can freeze it and then it'll keep indefinitely. It's fairly thin when it's hot, and loosen the lid a little there, and so it's easy to work into cracks and seams and things like that when you're doing repair work. hot hide glue has a pretty short open time. Oh, by open time we mean how long can you wait between when you apply the glue to when you actually have to clamp it and everything's held together. Sometimes with a complex repair you might have to clamp in multiple directions at once. So this is a guitar that I'm repairing, and you can see there's some cleats in here and there's some cracks that are still open, and the tail block was unglued from the back and the back was unglued from the sides back here, and there was when I started gluing this back together I had to clamp the sides back to the block to the back, and the sides to the back, reglue the linings, and there was just a lot of different things gluing all at once. And when you have a lot of different things being glued at once, the clamping of that's fairly complex. You've got clamps going in different directions and angles. I've got a picture that I'll post as part of that gluing process, you can see. So sometimes a really short open time like hot hide glue, really just difficult to work with. To get everything clamped up before that glue starts to gel can be a problem. So a lot of what I use for repair is fish glue. Now fish glue, if you're not familiar with it, is also a protein-based glue. Now I get this from Luthier's Mercantile, and it's just called high-tack fish glue. And I believe this is made by Norland for them. You can probably buy it direct from Norland or from some other sources. Stuart McDonald also has it as well. And if you look down in this jar, you can see it's all kind of chunky, or it looks like I've been cutting pieces out of it. Right now it's the consistency of really thick jello. So what I do is I take a palette knife and I'll stick in there and I'll cut out hunks of it and scoop those out. Every now and then I have to let this warm up and turn to liquid so that it's not like that. But it, to make it easier to get out. As the bottle gets lower, I'll have to actually let it thaw so I can pour it out to put it in a container. But rather than, I keep this in the refrigerator, and then I'll put those chunks in this jar, and the seal on this stuff is really sticky, and the seal on this thing is, as you can see, I'm going to have to get a new seal for this cap because this seal is no longer, it's coming apart. There we go. So this stuff is just super sticky. This will be the stickiest glue you ever have used. It has a really high tack, and when the label on the bottle says high tack glue, they mean it. This stuff is sticky, and when you put pieces together with it, it has a lot of, so like when I put cleats in a back, you saw the cleats I put in on that guitar, you can push those, a little bit of glue on the back, push the cleats down, and then the tack is so high on that glue you don't even have to clamp them. And one of the neat things about both hide glue and this fish glue is as they dry they shrink. So when you glue two pieces together, as that glue dries it actually pulls them tighter together. Now don't rely on that to pull your cracks together. If they have some separation, that's not going to work. But when you are gluing things together, that high tack is very helpful in holding things together, at least until you can get clamps on. Now, downside of fish glue is it takes a long time to set. So when you clamp something up with fish glue, you're going to leave it 10-12 hours. Often, it says 12 hours, what is that clamping time? Suggested clamping time for wood, 12 hours. Now, just like hide glue, though, you can reactivate this with water and with heat. And so if you need to undo something you've glued, you can get it apart without damaging things. So, and the other thing that's kind of important to know, both hide glue and fish glue will reactivate themselves, and fish glue will reactivate hide glue, which is kind of neat. And you can actually heat fish glue up. I've been known to put this bottle of fish glue in my glue pot to warm it up to get it a little thinner, especially if I'm going to use it to repair a glue joint that was originally done with hide glue, because the heat will help it reactivate the hide glue. So this, I use a lot of fish glue. It's very handy. It's not a fast glue. Again, you've got to clamp things up and just leave them, for a day. But it has a very long open time, so you can, you can work, kind of leisurely at getting things lined up. And, when you're, like, say, putting a top back on a guitar, this guitar I just showed you, the top has been off of it. I got it from a guy I used to go to church with who did some repair, and he took the top off, and then it was left that way for many, many years. And so the sides don't really match the top anymore. And so when I glue that back on, it'll be a process of using clamps and things to force the sides to have the shape of the top again, and then to get it all clamped. So a long open time will be very useful. So fish glue, if you haven't ever used fish glue and you do any kind of woodworking, I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic glue. And again, it is a protein-based glue. If you want to use something traditional, it's very, very good. Now, when it comes to aliphatic resin glues like the infamous Titebond, the glue that I actually tend to use is another one from Luthier's Mercantile, and it's their LMI yellow instrument glue. Now, according to them, this actually dries harder than Titebond. Not that it's necessarily stronger, but that it transfers sound better because it dries harder. So one of the functions of glue in a musical instrument is transfer the sound vibrations from one piece to another. And if the glue is softer, then it tends to dampen those vibrations. And a glue that's harder, like hide glue or a fish glue, I mean, these get really hard when they're dry, like brittle hard. And so these, these will, they're easy to use and all that, but the Titebond is not going to transfer sound, potentially, as well as the Luthier's Mercantile yellow instrument glue. At least that's what Luthier's Mercantile claims. This all contains a fluorescent dye, so if you glue something up and you want to make sure there's no glue that you haven't scraped off that's going to affect your finish, you can put the instrument under a black light, and any residual glue that you haven't cleaned up or scraped off will show up under black light. I haven't actually tried that, but it seems like kind of a neat deal. I don't use the little squirt lid thing that came on this. I put small amounts of it in these little glue bottles. I bought a bunch of these. I don't even remember where I bought them now. I think at Rockler. But they're little glue bottles, and they have a little tip with a silicone cover. And so I can use this to work glue into cracks and things like that, and I just fill these. You can squeeze these. It's a squeeze bottle, and so I use these to just squeeze glue into places that I need it. If I'm going to use a greater volume of it, like gluing on a fingerboard or something, I have a glue brush, and this came from Rockler. Actually, it was a free gift on one of their. We just opened a Rockler store they did here in Oklahoma City, and they had a bunch of giveaways, and so this was in one of the goodie bags, and it's turned out to be pretty neat for doing large glue ups. I have some regular glue brushes too, your traditional glue brushes that are commonly used for gluing up things. I have a big package of these things up here, and the only thing I don't like about these is you have to really kind of check them. The little hairs tend to come out, and you can end up with pieces of hair in your glue joint if you're not careful. I do use Titebond from time to time. If it's something that I'm not really worried about sound transfer, or just really want good strength and convenience, Titebond is a great glue, and I definitely use that. Okay. The next thing are, I'm going to say this wrong probably, cyanocryolate or super glues. I use a pair of them. This label is gone off this, but this is actually from Loctite. It's a Loctite medium super glue. And I'm not sure why the labels decided to peel up, but they all just decided to come off. This is this stick fast. It's a very thin. This is something you can use to wick into places like if you've got frets that are loose, you can clamp them down and then wick this underneath the edges of the fret. It's very thin, and you know, there's a variety of uses for super glue. I don't really ever use super glue to repair like wood pieces and things like that. I'll use it to temporarily hold things together, making jigs and things like that. The thin super glue is good for wicking under pieces that you need to hold together that aren't, you know, like real structural pieces like linings and, you know, loose frets and things like that. I use those in conjunction with this accelerator. There's probably enough accelerator here to last me the rest of my life, but if it doesn't go bad. But I really don't use a tremendous amount of super glue, but when you need these super glues, they're super handy because you can glue something and then you can activate it and it just works really fast. On rare occasions, I do use epoxy, and this is a JB Weld, clear weld, you know, quick setting epoxy, 5-minute. If it's something that I really need a lot of strength for, I'm going to use a slow set epoxy instead of a 5-minute epoxy because it'll be stronger. I didn't grab a jar of that, or jars, but epoxy I'll only typically use where something has been glued before, the wood pores are filled with glue that you can't remove, and you've got to glue something back and have some structural strength. But usually those kind of situations are going to require some other reinforcement. Fixing things that somebody has already glued, especially if they've used, you know, like Titebond or something, trying to get the old glue out. There are some chemicals. There's one called Goo Gone that will take off this glue. It's basically acetic acid will dissolve this. And I actually have some acetic acid used to use in the darkroom to make some darkroom chemicals for photography. So I have some of that. But epoxy is something I try not to use very often. One thing I did not mention about the super glues is you can get these little tips that are really fine. So if you need to get your glue into a very tiny area, these are really handy. And again, we have a new Rockler store in our city, in Oklahoma City, and they have these. They're really handy to have those. Okay. Probably the last thing glue-wise is good old Duco. Now, typically I'll use this for plastic bindings on guitars. It's kind of been used for that for a long time. Sometimes I'll use Titebond for linings. If you use Titebond, you typically are going to need to abrade or sand the inside of the lining, the backside, so that the glue can hang on to it, and then that works pretty well. Duco cement, like super glue, is something that can damage finishes. So if you're fixing a finish that's a lacquer finish or something, using Titebond is typically the safer way that won't damage a finish. Because if you get some of this on a lacquered finish or even some varnish finishes, it can damage it. And so it's good for new construction, but for repairs, I tend to use the wood glue, the Titebond, for that kind of thing. Okay. As I mentioned, I use brushes for putting on glue. This is the glue brush I typically use for hot hide glue, or maybe one of these if I'm gluing on something larger like a fingerboard where I need more space. I use a palette knife quite a bit for working glue into small spaces. I have 2 or 3 palette knives, and not only use them for separating seams to take things apart, but also use these for working glue underneath in areas. And so those are very handy. And so that's kind of my glue world, as it were. The use of a variety of different glues means that you're going to be able to handle just about any repair situation, and you can get things repaired and put together efficiently. And like I say, just like any tool, there's not one tool that works for everything. You can't use a saw for a screwdriver, and you can't use a pair of scissors to tighten bolts. There's different tools for different things. And in the same way, there's different glues that work better for different applications. So when you're doing repair work, it's really important to have a good understanding of the different glues and their properties, and when they best apply. And to be honest, you can read or listen to videos all you want about these glues. You really have to use them. You know, you have to actually get some and try them and use them. Before I started using hot hide glue, I just, you know, I learned to mix it up. It's like a ratio of, some people say of by weight, 2 parts of glue to 1 water, and some say 1.9, maybe the other way around. I always have to read my instructions I have written down before I do it. Anyway, before you mix it up and use it on a real project, you're definitely going to want to mix some up and just play with it and test it and get the consistency right. And when you dip your brush in glue, it shouldn't drip off. It should kind of run off in a thin stream if you've got the consistency right. So it's there's a learning curve on that, and I could make a whole video on just on using hide glue. I may do that at some point, but it's important to understand that these glues, the properties they have, and try some of these things out, and glue some test pieces together, understand what the working times are, understand how much tack they have. Like this fish glue, and hide glue is very similar. You can it's called rubbing joints. You can glue 2 things together and basically rub the 2 pieces of wood together to push out all the excess glue and air, and then they'll hold often without any clamping, due to the high tack nature of those glues. So understanding how to use these glues and understanding their properties is really important. But the best way, you can read about it all you want, you can watch videos. You really just need to get some of these glues and get some scrap wood and do some testing. And I think you'll find that all these glues, like the fish glue, the hide glue, the instrument glue, yellow instrument glue, and Type Bond, are all glues that are going to create joints that are stronger than the wood itself. Typically, if something's glued properly and then you break it apart, it's actually not going to break on the glue joint, it's going to break next to it or something like that, because the glue joints are actually, in many cases, stronger than the wood itself. And all those glues have that kind of strength, but they have different properties in terms of how you apply the glues, and in some cases possibly even how they transfer sound. I think luthiers over time would pretty much say, your violin makers would say never use anything but hot hide glue, and that's pretty much all they use. But those instruments are pretty small. Gluing a top on a violin, it's not that long of a glue joint. You can get hot hide glue all the way around it and you can get your top on. But a guitar is another thing that's a lot bigger. And so you can do that, but often it means you have to heat your work environment, even maybe slightly heat the parts like with a hairdryer, so that you extend the working time of that hot hide glue. So for a lot of repair applications, I find the fish glue to be just a better alternative. Easier to, longer open time, and yet still I'm using a traditional protein-based glue. So anyway, that's kind of my world of glues, and I hope this was helpful for you to see some of this. Well, that was a sticky subject. Actually, I really love all the different kinds of glues that are available, and some I like to use more than others, and as you do this kind of work, you find yourself gravitating towards one type of adhesive or another for different reasons. And I think it's important to have a good understanding of all the different adhesives that are available, and where you can source them. And some things you can get locally, some things you have to order in, and so there's just a wide variety. But they're all very useful, and so I hope you're able to benefit from some of that information. If you have any thoughts or comments, please don't hesitate to leave me a comment. And as always, thanks for watching.